thank you all for joining, and I'm going to try and keep this focused and succinct. It may not be brief, and it's not going to be simple. What I'm trying to do is to provide an overview that informs you and gives you the information that I think you need in order to independently and objectively assess the policies and the approach our town is taking to wildfire prevention and safety in our community. So I'm going to begin by giving you an overview of the regulatory scheme that our town government operates under in the context of fire prevention and fire safety. And it starts at the federal level. Through the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, the Federal Disaster Mitigation Act requires local communities, in order to qualify for FEMA funding or grants, to assess their local hazards. If you want the federal government to be the funder of last resort when you have a tornado blast through your town, or you've got a flood, or a wildfire burns your community down, you should, at least in advance of those circumstances, understand the hazards and risks that you confront and act prudently to mitigate the risk. So the Federal Disaster Mitigation Act is a program that requires communities throughout the country to engage in a risk mitigation exercise, to look at the hazards they confront, to acknowledge them honestly, and to begin undertaking measures to mitigate them. At the state level, since the Oakland Hills fire in 1996, the legislature passed provisions in the government code that require CAL FIRE to identify throughout California very high and high fire hazard severity areas. They were to identify those in both state responsibility areas where the state picks up the tab, and in local responsibility areas where local municipalities are responsible for fire suppression. And then the local agency was to, having received CAL FIRE's designation of hazard areas within its community, was to designate by ordinance the very high fire hazard severity zones and the high fire hazard severity zones within their jurisdiction, and to send that ordinance back to the state. So this is a program to help inform and categorize areas of hazard and risk and bring it to the attention of localities and get the localities to embrace, to acknowledge and recognize the situation that confronts them. Then the Public Resources Code, in addition to that, empowers CAL FIRE to promulgate regulations that control development, that regulate how these hazardous lands, areas of very high fire hazard severity, can be developed. What kinds of roads are required, what kinds of infrastructure for water and fire suppression required, and they specify what kinds of defensible space requirements, both for vegetative removal, but also separation distance between homes. And then most recently, the legislature has enacted a provision that requires, within very high fire hazard areas, not only a defensible space inspection of every home, so that you get, in a sense, an assessment and an understanding of what your situation is, but also disclosure whenever you sell of the fire hazard risk that is in your property and of the steps for mitigation you've taken or should be taken by the new owner. That's at the state level. At the local level, the state has imposed mandates on localities. And in addition to the requirement to designate your fire hazard severity zones, a lot of towns weren't owning up. The towns weren't responding. And so in 2012, the legislature enacted SB 1241 that requires every locality, every local agency in a very high fire hazard severity area to amend their safety element of the general plan to include a comprehensive hazard and risk assessment for their community, to identify the policies and programs and adopt the ordinances that are required to mitigate that, and to send that all to the state board so that the state board and the local fire district can review what you're proposing to do and give you comments and feedback on your plan. Since then, there have been enactments that require updating of that for climate change, and there's a specific provision that required by July 21, the town to adopt, revise the safety element to specify evacuation routes, capacity, safety, viability, to take on the need to understand our evacuation capability and emergency response. Well, what have we done? Have we done any of this? In 2008, CAL FIRE, the Woodside Fire Protection District, and an expert consultant hired by the town named Ray Moritz all recommended designation of very high and high fire hazard severity zones in Portola Valley's local responsibility area. At that time, 2008, 2009, there was a discussion in town before the board, before the council, and it unanimously rejected that proposal. Did so because of concerns about effect on insurability and property values. 2010, the town amended the safety element in its general plan, and it called on the town to publicize and implement the Moritz recommendations, but it did nothing else. It didn't adopt the Moritz map. It didn't publish the Moritz map. The Moritz map is not available on the town website. I challenge each of you to get access to it and to look at it without contacting me. I have it and I can get it for you. But if you want to know what the hazard and risk depicted in the Moritz map was, you're not going to see it on the town website. In 2012, SB 1241 required all the cities with very high fire hazard severity zones to incorporate wildfire hazard and risk assessments into their revised safety elements, and to get it done by 2015. Now, that's a fire safety mandate. It's not a housing mandate. We didn't do it. We ignored it. In 2014, the governor's office provided extensive written guidance for localities on how to do a hazard and risk assessment and how to revise your safety element and what kinds of policies and programs needed to be adopted. In 2018, CAL FIRE issued a strategic fire plan for California. We're going to look at that in a moment, briefly. In 2020, the governor's office updated the guidance for the wildfire hazard and risk assessments, prevention policies, and programs. It's 2021, and we still haven't done any of this. So let's be candid. On last Wednesday, the town council presented for consent adoption by the entire town council a hazard mitigation plan. This was the depiction of hazard and risk that the town included in their self-assessment of the wildfire hazard and risks they confront. And I don't know, I hope you can see my cursor. This is Woodside, all this red area over here. This is the town boundary in yellow all the way around. This is Jasper Ridge in the upper part of it. And then this is the Western Hills outside. This is Skyline along here. This is Windy Hill. These are the Western Hills here. And then we come down through Arastadero, Los Trancos, and then we come into Alpine Road. This is Ladera, and you can see that magically there's no fire hazard or risk in Portola Valley, except where the state has mandated in state responsibility areas a designation. This is the 2008 Moritz map, identifying the highest hazard areas in town. Now, Moritz did something that CAL FIRE didn't do. CAL FIRE, when they did their mapping, when you look at the map on the left, this is what I call a first generation hazard and risk assessment on the left. CAL FIRE used aerial photographs, remote sensing, and at that time, what was then state of the art, but very crude means to assess the density of vegetation. They were looking at the density of fuel loading on the landscape. And then they laid that on top of a topography And they said, well, these are the areas with highest fuel density in the most dangerous terrain. And that's how they categorized hazard and risk. What Moritz did for the town in 2008 was he actually walked the entire town. He did a ground inspection, field confirmed the vegetation and the terrain, and identified the specific terrain. So you have canyons here. This is a canyon with 2 steep ravines. This is a canyon with a steep ravine. This is a canyon with a steep ravine. You've got very prolific grass vegetation in Camison here. He went through the whole town and did a field inspection, did a very sophisticated analysis with a higher standard than the state set for what he characterized as highest hazards. He identified 19 areas in town, and they're strewn all across the town, throughout population centers as well as wildlands. Well, what did the governor's guidance tell Portola Valley, tell municipalities we should be doing about preparing a hazard and risk assessment? It said, first of all, well, complete your local hazard mitigation plan for FEMA. Do that, get that done. Secondly, revise your general safety plan elements by 2015 to protect communities from very high hazard. And what should the general plan assess? Well, the guidance went through that in detail and specified exactly the kinds of considerations that need to be built into a realistic hazard and risk assessment. I only want to point out one here: average, worst, fire danger, and rates of spread. Now, average is built over historical experience. Worst is the worst event you ever had. In California, we have had the worst wildfires in our history in the last 2 years.
Yeah.
And what we're confronting is a dramatic change in climate. Dramatic means a 1 degree increase in temperature creates a dramatic effect on vegetation, aridity, and risk.
Are you going somewhere or what?
And what the planning is required to focus on is the worst fire danger. The planning is required to focus on what are we most likely, in the worst case scenario, likely to encounter. And then the last thing was to detail local prevention and mitigation measures. This was to have been done by 2015. It's 2021, we haven't done it. What did California's strategic fire plan? This is CAL FIRE after the Tubbs fire, before Paradise. This happened in August of 2018, 2 months before Paradise burned down. Jerry Brown, after Tubbs, got on CAL FIRE and said, come up with a strategic fire plan for the whole state. Identify the priorities. What's the most important? What's the next most important thing? Goal 1, identify and evaluate the wildland hazards and populations properties at risk. In other words, implement the hazard and risk classifications and profiling that are required under California law. And then, once you've done that, promote local land use planning processes to protect life, property, and natural resources. Now understand, this is very important to focus on. Goal 2 is to promote land use planning. That is, don't make it worse. Don't continue with hazardous development. Don't focus on just building and how you build a property. Focus on how you develop the property, how you use the property, where you place buildings on the landscape, because that's what's extending the hazard and risk into wildland communities. Goal 3, develop and implement local and regional plans to mitigate wildfire hazards and emergency readiness and response. And goal 4, reach out, educate residents and landowners, include them in these discussions, help them become aware of what's going on. Don't ignore the situation and act like it doesn't exist. In 2020, the governor's advisory came out with an update on how to do these hazard and risk assessments. And it's important because I want you to consider, not that this is everything that's in the advisory, there's a lot in the advisory, but think of these principles as they apply to our community. Local governments should prepare wildfire hazard and risk assessments describing the existing fire hazard environment, the projected future changes in that, and the populations and assets at risk. It's the responsibility of our local government to do this work to inform its residents what situation we're confronting here and how it's going to evolve in the future. Avoid new land uses or developments in very high and high fire hazard severity zones and sites where modeling demonstrates unreasonable risk. Don't push this development into hazardous lands. Designate very high and high fire hazard severity zones as open space or other similar land use designations to buffer against wildfire threats, together with policies and programs to mitigate risk. Don't take these open spaces and turn them into yet more housing. Well, the legislature is growing increasingly impatient with the slow rate of progress among some municipalities in fire safety. And so in 2019, they adopted a provision that requires CAL FIRE to create what is called the Risk Reduction Communities Program. And that is to identify the communities that are seriously engaged in fire risk reduction in their community. What are the communities that are actually engaged in the best practices for reducing fire risk in their community? And this program has teeth because you have to be on this list in order to qualify for state grants from CAL FIRE. And to get on this list, you have to pass the first 4 required best practices. You have to do all 4 of these first things, and you have to do at least 2 of the 6 that remain. And I'm going to talk about 3 of these, the first 3. The very first thing that's a required practice to be on CAL FIRE's risk reduction program is you have to have adopted a town ordinance that designates the very high fire hazard severity zones in your town, and you have to have submitted that ordinance for approval from the state board. The second thing you have to do is you have to submit within those very high fire hazard severity zones any parcel map or any tentative map for subdivision or development within those areas. It has to be based on the state regulations regulating development in very high fire hazard severity zones. And only if you have done that and submitted those to the county, and those then get submitted to the state, only if you are developing in accordance with the risk, in accordance with the regulations that apply to the risk, then do you qualify. And the third thing is you have to have submitted within the past 8 years an updated safety element. Remember, I talked about SB 1241. And that was supposed to have been done in 2015. And if you haven't done it, if you haven't submitted that updated safety element that addresses wildfire, if you haven't identified the practices that you're going to employ and the ordinances you've adopted, and if they haven't been approved by CAL FIRE, and if you haven't implemented everything that CAL FIRE and Woodside Fire Protection has recommended you do in response to that, you don't get on the list. So this is a wake-up call, setting a high standard for what does it mean to be a risk reduction community. Where's Portola Valley stand against this scorecard? Well, this is where it stands. Hasn't done any of them, not one. And this is something that the residents of this town really need to understand. We need to hold our town council up to the objective mirror of CAL FIRE's assessment and ask ourselves, are they serving our interests? I'm going to turn briefly to the hazard mitigation plan that was presented on the consent agenda at the last town council meeting. This was presented for unanimous approval without discussion or public debate. It was prepared over the last 6 months, as you can see, by the town. In that assessment, this was the risk ranking that Portola Valley provided for various hazards: earthquake, landslide, severe weather, wildfire. Here, you can see that wildfire comes in the town's assessment at the very low end of medium risk. It's not high, and it's not as high as severe weather. It's about the same as flood. Let's contrast that with Woodside. Woodside ranks wildfire as the #1 threat to its community, with almost 3 times the risk ranking as Portola Valley assigns. This is what a comparison of Portola Valley and Woodside's hazard rankings looks like. Remarkable agreement about earthquake, landslide, severe weather, flood, drought. Woodside's closer to a dam because of Crystal Springs, but sea level rise and tsunami. We assess those the same. But look at wildfire. What accounts for this incredible difference in appreciation and understanding of hazard and risk when it comes to wildfire? Look at this comparison. Portola Valley assesses that only 9.3% of its population is exposed to wildfire. I'd like to know what 9.3% of this town is exposed, because I sure feel exposed. I feel the rest of you must be lucky. I live right next to Jasper Ridge, and I don't know where the other 97% or 91% of people in the town live, and look at the property value exposed. Now, in the CZU fire, 1,000 structures burned, over 500 structures in Boulder Creek. Property damage was over $1 billion. In the glass fire in Sonoma and Napa counties, property damage was $3.6 billion. In Coffee Park and Fountain Grove, the property damage was $7.2 billion. And in Paradise, $17 billion of property was destroyed in 24 hours. And Portola Valley is telling FEMA and us that less than $80 million worth of property is exposed to wildfire in our town. Now, just by reference, the assessed valuation, the assessed tax valuation in Portola Valley is $3.5 billion. That's tax value. The market value is probably closer to $5 billion. I think it's time for us to be candid. Why are we telling FEMA in a federal document that's required in order to qualify for grant funding to cover our hazards and risks that, we don't have any wildfire risk in Portola Valley? And I think it's also time to be candid about who drafted this. You may have heard at the town council meeting a number of excuses or justifications that, well, this wasn't our assessment. We were pushing back on this. We didn't agree with this. Well, according to the hazard mitigation plan, there are 2 types of planning partners who prepared this: municipalities and special districts. The municipalities prepared their assessments. The special districts like Woodside prepared theirs. Woodside did not rank the hazard, and Woodside Fire District did not rank the hazard and risk within the municipality. Portola Valley did. Each participating planning partner prepared a jurisdiction-specific annex that had its hazard and risk assessment to this plan. And in the risk ranking exercise, each planning partner, Portola Valley, was asked to review the ranked risk specifically for its jurisdiction based on the impact on its population or facilities. Municipalities base this ranking on the probability of occurrence and the potential impact on people, property, and the economy. This was prepared by the local hazard mitigation planning team. Jeremy Dennis, Brandy Jameau, Howard Young, and Laura Russell. These are the people that prepared this assessment. And why aren't we being told this? Why don't we understand this? Why are we told the county did it or the county's consultant? And they disagreed with it. Last thing we're going to touch on here is the current hazard mapping is incomplete. And I think it's very important for you to understand this as residents because, you know, for points that have been made about simplify this and we need to simplify this message. And so you're going to hear a lot about hazard mapping. Well, hazard mapping says this, hazard mapping says that, this area is in the hazard. You need to understand what that hazard map is showing and what it's based on. CAL FIRE and Moritz hazard assessments are based on vegetation, topography, climate, crown fire, which is very intense vegetative fire potential, ember production, and fire history. Those are the elements upon which the hazard and risk assessment are based. They're not based on structural fuel loading or the total energy density of hazardous terrain. What's that mean? Well, that means that these hazard maps are based on only a part of the fuels that feed a wildfire. They don't consider, there is no consideration whatsoever of the structures and of the vehicles and of the other infrastructure that also adds to, and in many cases exceeds, the energy potential, the enthalpy of the energy released by a fire. And what's happened is that we're now, as a result of Coffee Park, Fountain Grove, the Tubbs Fire, Paradise, the Calder Fire, the CZU Fire, the Glass Fire, count them right and left. What we're now beginning to recognize and understand is that the structural fuels and the total energy density is what's driving the massive destruction, the catastrophic destruction when it occurs in these fires. We can't ignore the contribution that these structural fuels and the vehicle fuels are adding to these fires. And so when we do a hazard and risk assessment, we've got to go beyond just looking at vegetation. And here's an example that brings home what I'm talking about. This is CAL FIRE's hazard mapping of Coffee Park, right here, and Fountain Grove. Yellow is low, brown is medium, red is very high fire hazard. These communities burned to the ground in less than 8 hours. And the hazard wasn't even mapped, wasn't recognized, because they didn't consider the hazard or risk of structural fuel density. This was the destruction in Coffee Park. This is the destruction in Fountain Grove. Not even on the map, not even recognized, not acknowledged, not accounted for in land use planning, building code, development restrictions. So if we're going to do a comprehensive hazard and risk assessment, we have to go beyond the first generation mapping of CAL FIRE, which doesn't recognize and doesn't require the town to recognize the hazard and risk within our town. We got to go beyond the second generation mapping of Moritz, which looks through the whole town and sees, yeah, there's a hell of a lot of hazard and risk here, but is based entirely on vegetative hazard and risk. And then we've got to look at all of the houses, all of the structures, the density of the houses, the construction of the houses, and the fuel that they add to any fire that starts in this town or comes to this town. That's what a real hazard and risk assessment entails. And that's what we should be demanding for our protection. This is a letter that Don Bullard sent to the Woodside Town Council on December 13th, 4 days after he spoke to our town council, 5 days after he spoke to our town council on December 8th. I just want to share, this is up on the Woodside Town Council. I can provide the links for you if you want to read the letter yourself. He since sent a second letter which embellishes and expands on this. I just want to read a few passages from it for you. SB 9 would encourage much more structure density and people to live in very high and high fire severity areas, increase the risk of ember cast structure ignitions, structure to structure fire spread, and increase the risk of clogged roads. I cannot stress enough how this could lead to the potential loss of life for residents and fire personnel. Homes and neighborhoods built in and among the wildlands are not just vulnerable or exposed to wildfire. They are an important cause of catastrophic destruction. There aren't quotes around this, but this is a quote from his letter. Compelling evidence clearly demonstrates that increased density and an adequate separation of buildings from one another can be the most significant cause of home-to-home ignitions and fire spread. Now, focus on this last point, that inadequate separation of buildings, because buildings are such a major source of enthalpy, of fuel for fires. Inadequate separation of buildings can be the most significant cause of home-to-home ignitions and fire spread. That's why the hazard mapping that needs to be done has to look at the location of housing and the construction of housing. So the town council and others argue that we should not adopt an ordinance to prevent wildfire spreading from structure to structure until we know with scientific certainty what separation distance, 30 feet, 45 feet, 60 feet, or something less will suffice. Till we know that with certainty, we can't choose. I believe the petition and its supporters fundamentally disagree. I think when you're faced with scientific uncertainty about optimally safe separation distance, we should require a minimally prudent separation distance. We should act now with minimal prudence to require the minimum separation. CAL FIRE and the National Fire Protection Association also agree. CAL FIRE's regulations require a 30-foot separation and a 30-foot setback in communities like ours. And the National Fire Protection Association recommends that adoption as a standard in all communities like ours. If a lesser separation distance is scientifically demonstrated to be safe in all cases, well, sure, then we can relax it when we have the scientific certainty to do so. But until then, it's sound policy requires us to adopt prudent standards now. And we should adjust them later and only later if scientific certainty warrants. This is what the debate Wednesday before the town council should have been about. This is the debate we need to have in our town. This is the debate I encourage all of you to become informed about and understand so that you can engage your neighbors in it, so you can reach out to your neighbors and have them understand and recognize that the issue here is, are we going to wait for somebody to tell us, well, we can't do anything until there's scientific certainty? Or are we going to act minimally prudent to protect ourselves from what is obviously an egregious hazard and risk that little, if anything, is being done about? So what would prudent risk reduction look like? If we were to be minimally prudent, what would we do? Well, we would certainly designate by ordinance all the fire hazard severity areas in town. CAL FIRE has made that abundantly clear. They've been asking for it for almost 2 decades now. We would require a 30-foot separation between buildings throughout town, pending adoption of more comprehensive standards. And right now, please understand, if the town had designated by ordinance the fire hazard severity of our community in accordance with the Moritz map, then state law would require a 30-foot minimum building separation and a 30-foot minimum setback under CAL FIRE's minimum fire safe development standards throughout our community. That's what we should ask for. And we need to grant the district, the fire district. They seem reluctant to take this, but we need to grant them the authority to interpret and enforce fire prevention objectives in our municipal code. 1848-010 are the standards that specify minimum lot size, setbacks on all sides of a building, maximum building square footage. Those parameters define the fuel complex, the energy density, the fire hazard, and propensity for fire propagation and spread from that parcel to other parcels. We should insist that our fire district has the authority, the competency, and the responsibility to review how structures are being placed in relationship to one another and what fuel complex is being created on a parcel and what kind of hazard and risk that poses to neighboring and adjoining properties. And finally, 60 years ago, this town led the nation in the adoption of objective hazard-based land use and development and construction standards for seismic safety. It was done not at the insistence of the town council, not at the insistence of the planning commission. It was done by citizens, happened to be geologists, geologists working at the USGS in Stanford. Dwight Crowder led the crowd, who said, you know, given the hazard and risk that we live amidst with the San Andreas fault and all of the faults through the foothills uplift, we're nuts. We're nuts to go on building as though that hazard and risk doesn't exist. We need to assess and understand what it is and develop appropriate land use standards to recognize that. And he pushed through a seismic safety program in town. The residents, pushed the town council to finally adopt a seismic safety ordinance in town that did exactly that, specified the hazard and risk on detailed maps throughout town and set appropriate building standards geared to the hazard and risk the land created and presented. We need to do the same thing now. And unfortunately, it's going to fall to the residents in town to make that happen because this town council is adamantly opposed to this and will not do it. So with that, I'll stop and thank you very much for your attention and your patience. And I'll throw it back to Bob.